The corridor reeked of scorched metal and copper blood. Sub-Commander Thelis signaled the retreat. His two primary eyes were dilated wide, while his ruined third eye twitched in the violent strobe of the emergency lights. His hands went cold first. Then his arms. By the time the ice reached his chest, he had forgotten what the word for warm was. The climate controls on his transport shuttle had been perfectly calibrated 6 hours earlier. Thelis had stepped onto the breach station expecting a standard retrieval of a single, bound prisoner. A low hum vibrated through the deck plating. The Varian strike squad moved with synchronized precision. Their silver scales reflected the bright, erratic sparks from severed ceiling conduits. Thelis led the formation, his third eye, permanently half-closed and scarred pale from an old plasma burn, throbbing in the shifting atmospheric pressure of the damaged station. They navigated the debris field with practiced efficiency, stepping over fallen support beams and shattered display screens. Finally, they reached the main command center and breached the heavy blast doors, weapons raised and ready for any immediate resistance from the station's remaining crew. It was empty. In the center of the room sat the captain's chair. Heavy restraint straps hung from its arms. The thick synthetic webbing had been sliced clean through. Thelis ran a scaled digit over the frayed edges. The cuts were rough, desperate, and made from the inside. Whoever had been locked in that seat had carved their way out. Thelis felt a strange tightening in his primary stomach. A prisoner was supposed to be waiting for them, docile and secured for transport, which meant the mission parameters had changed. This signaled his squad to fan out into the darkness of Sector 4. The air tasted of ozone and dried chemical foam. Shadows stretched and twisted along the bulkheads as the squad's collective gaze scanned the wreckage, their four eyes blinking entirely out of sync. Sub-Commander. Private Kale hissed over the comlink. Motion sensor tripped in the lower transit hall. I have a read on the target. Numbers? Thelis asked. One. One squad? No, sir. Kale's scales lost their silver sheen, fading to a sickly white. One human. Thelis ground his teeth. A single human should have been a trivial obstacle for a full Varian strike team. However, biological reports from the Sol system classified humanity as persistence predators. Long before they built starships, early humans hunted by chasing targets for hours across open terrain. They simply walked their prey to death through sheer, unrelenting endurance. They did not need to outrun a beast. They only needed to outlast its oxygen supply, its muscular limits, and its willpower. Thelis knew this evolutionary fact intellectually, filed away in a briefing document. He was about to learn exactly how it applied to modern orbital warfare. Have you ever realized you were the prey only after the trap had already closed? They pushed deeper into the corridor. The station's life support systems were failing. The ambient temperature dropped by the minute. The Varian's blood relies heavily on environmental heat to maintain combat efficiency. The cold seeped through their armor, slowing their reflexes and making their joints ache. Beneath the flickering red glow of a damaged junction box, a figure stood at the far end of the hall. The human held a battered kinetic rifle. It did not raise the weapon to fire. It did not retreat into the adjacent maintenance shafts. It merely watched them, perfectly still, letting the freezing air do the work. They fired first. Plasma bolts scorched the bulkheads, turning the freezing corridor into a sudden oven of localized heat. The intense thermal blooms offered a brief, deceptive comfort to the cold-blooded Varians, but the human merely ducked behind a reinforced structural pillar. The kinetic rifle cracked twice in response. The primitive, unguided slugs shattered the overhead lighting panels. Sparks rained down onto Private Kale's armor, forcing the strike squad to take cover behind a pile of twisted conduit. Thelis checked his weapon's charge and braced himself. He expected a counterattack. He expected a furious, chaotic, tactical push from a cornered animal. The human did absolutely nothing. Minutes crawled into hours. The station's life support bled the last of its thermal energy into the void. Thelis's limbs felt like heavy stone. Varian biology demanded ambient heat to maintain combat readiness, and their core temperatures were dropping dangerously close to the biological shutdown threshold. The human wasn't defending a physical location. The human was using the dying station as an environmental weapon, perfectly content to wait them out. Every ragged breath the Varian soldiers took crystallized in the air before them and shattered against the floorboards, while the solitary human just kept breathing in a steady, unbroken rhythm that sounded exactly like a countdown. Kale collapsed. His scales turned a dead matte gray. Thelis gripped his plasma rifle, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He peeked around the scorched conduit. The human finally stepped forward into a pool of emergency light. The kinetic rifle remained leveled perfectly at Thelis's chest. Frost clung to the human's uniform, but its hands were rock steady. "This is your only warning," the human said, voice raspy but resonant in the empty hall. "There will not be a second." Thelis's ruined third eye throbbed. He looked at his remaining soldiers. They were shivering, lethargic, entirely spent. They were finished, and so the desperate retreat began. The idling as he signaled the immediate fallback. He finally understood the terrible truth of the human biology he had read about. The human had never been trapped in that command center. The human had deliberately let them breach the station, let them spread out into the dark, and let them freeze. The corridor was not a defensive choke point, it was a snare. They had walked directly into it, fully armed and utterly outmatched by a creature that knew exactly how to weaponize patience. Thelis dragged Kale by the combat harness. He forced his freezing legs to move faster toward the docking bay, abandoning the mission objective, abandoning his pride. Every step felt like dragging his boots through deep water. The human did not pursue them. It did not need to chase them down the halls or fire a parting shot. The predator had already won simply by surviving. The docking bay blast doors finally sealed shut behind them. Through the thick reinforced viewport, Thelis looked back into the station. He thought of the captain's chair sitting in the dead center of the command room. Its severed restraints lay scattered on the floor like a shed skin. It was not a prison anymore. It was a monument to the predator that now owned the dark. What happens when an entire species builds its military doctrine around pure endurance? Find out in our next file.